Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Green Healthy Recovery from COVID-19 event. I'm very excited to welcome all of you today to this event. Before we kind of get started, I did want to open the session with a land acknowledgement. So I would like to acknowledge that I'm calling in from the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, as well as the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat and Haudenosaunee people. Land acknowledgements are a first step in reckoning with the harms and the mistakes of the past and signaling a commitment to understanding the history of the land that we occupy today and affirming the presence and the rights of Indigenous peoples. So I hope to invite all of you, and please join me in reflecting on the relationship that you have with the land that you're joining from today, as well as how we can move beyond land acknowledgements and move towards action for reconciliation and meaningful collaboration. Thank you very much for reflecting with me, and I'm very excited again to be moderating the session. My name is Harshini Ramesh. I am a research associate at Smart Prosperity Institute. And just to give you a bit of an overview for the event today, we'll have some introductory remarks by Bruce Laurie, who is the president of the Ivy Foundation. That'll be followed by a presentation by John McNally and Teslin Augustin, both esteemed colleagues from Smart Prosperity Institute. And that'll be followed by a discussion component. And that discussion component, we will be joined by our discussant, Dave Sawyer, who is a principal economist at the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices and executive in residence at Smart Prosperity Institute. So very jam-packed session, but also very exciting, and hopefully we can dig into some interesting topics. Just some few pieces about housekeeping. If you would like to ask questions, there is a Q&A box at the bottom of the screen that you can access to send us your questions, and the recording for this event will be available on the SPI YouTube channel. Without further ado, I'll just jump right into introducing Bruce Laurie, who, in addition to being the president of the Ivy Foundation, is a best-selling author, policy expert, social entrepreneur, and award-winning global sustainability leader. Thank you so much for joining us, and off to you.
Thank you so much, Harshini. Great to be here. I always like to talk about environment and health connections because it feels like that's where I really first started my career in the environment. And without going into the long version, was way back when I created a children's environmental health program at the Laidlaw Foundation in the mid-1990s. And one of the major things we did through that program was decide or recognize that that coal-fired power plants were at the source of many of the fundamental environmental challenges that we're dealing with today. So I was working with, I was a consultant working with the foundation, working with NGOs, and also working with some electricity companies. And it dawned on me that if you looked at campaigns that environmental groups were running on smog, on acid rain, on air pollution, toxic chemicals, climate change, that coal-fired power plants were at the center of all of these. And so I thought, well, why do we have all these different campaigns? Why don't we just create a campaign and go after coal-fired power plants? And it became clear as well that politicians were much more likely to listen to health experts than they were environmental groups. And the public was much more concerned about health and their kids' health and the health of the elderly than they were about things like climate change, acid rain. And so I think the big breakthrough in the campaign to phase out coal plants was when we got the Ontario Medical Association involved, and the Ontario Medical Association became the primary spokesperson for the campaign. And we had a small group working behind the scenes that coordinated the environmental organizations, and the front-facing campaign was run by Jack Gibbons and the Ontario Clean Air Alliance, which we created at the time to lead the campaign. And so it really was quite convincing to see how quickly the really the public came around on this, how quickly the government moved. We actually, people don't, probably wouldn't recall or frankly care, but way back then we actually got the conservative government, the liberal government, and the NDP government all to commit to phase out coal plants in advance of whatever the year of the election was, probably early 2000s. And so this became a importantly, kind of a cross-partisan issue because everyone cares about health. And then, of course, there's the costs associated with health, and we played up that significantly in the campaigns. And so I think going forward, and then as you probably know, I wrote a couple of books on environmental health and environmental contaminants. So the link between plastics and health is important, air quality and health. And I've always thought that if all of the money that was poured into anti-pipeline campaigns in Alberta actually went into the connection between oil sands production and human health, whether or not we wouldn't be further ahead on that issue. So if you look at air toxics, water pollution, those are all things when you look at the polling that Canadians are concerned about. They're much more concerned about, pollution, toxic chemicals, and clean air and clean water, even still today, than I think they are about climate change, although of course it's changing. So my strong recommendation, oh, and just to finish on the coal plant thing, so it was funny because many years later, everyone looks back at that and says, it was the single largest climate change action in North America, phasing out coal in Ontario. And if you look at the graphs of reductions, you'll see Ontario declining significantly because of the coal phase out. But the reality is climate change really was not a major part of the campaign to phase out coal plants in Ontario. It was, health and air quality as the two leading issues. I would certainly encourage anyone going forward to continue to look at health as a major driver, whether it's related to climate change or related to other environmental issues, because the public is more concerned about health. I think the COVID recovery conversation as it relates to climate change, and even if you look at, flooding related to health in buildings, or you look at the fires that we're seeing related to air quality and health, there's a very strong health link to almost anything related to climate change. Lyme disease, there's, heat effect in cities, all of these things that important work's being done on, including by people in Square here. Anyway, so I will end there, but just say that, I think it's great that you are having this conversation, because I think often environmentalists ignore the importance of the health message in these kinds of campaigns. So thanks very much, and great to be here.
Thanks so much for those remarks. That's so fascinating to learn about this cross-sectoral collaboration and how health basically changed the tide of the conversation. I think that sets us up really nicely to sort of share some of the research that we've been doing at Smart Prosperity Institute, and to kind of share what we've found through our research. I'll toss the mic over to my colleagues, John McNally and Tessa McGustin. So John is a research associate with us. Before joining the team in 2019, he previously worked as an analyst with the Environment Canada's Energy and Transport Directorate. He also holds a master's in sustainable energy policy from Carleton University and has spent time working in the third sector supporting corporate sustainability and urban planning initiatives. Teslin is also a research associate with us, and she brings 6 years of international experience to SBI and has previously worked as a legislative assistant to a senior member of the Indian Federal Parliament. She has also spent some time as a public affairs consultant working closely with Fortune 500 companies. Teslin has a master's in public policy from the Willy Brandt School of Public Policy in Germany and is a lawyer called to the bar in India. As a part of the research that the both of them have been doing, there were 2 reports that came out about sort of this intersection of a green recovery and health. And I think that'll be shared in the chat, but without further ado, I'll just toss the mic over to the both of them to give an overview of our research and explore more about this topic.
Thanks a lot, Harshini. And credit where credit's due. Harshini's being humble. She was actually part of the research process for this as well. So can't give all the credit to Teslin and myself. So first off, I want to extend a big thank you for everyone taking the time to join us today, and to Harshini and Bruce for those great thoughtful introductions. So as Bruce noted, that the discussions around clean air and clean water, in our eyes, have massive potential to drive forward really positive outcomes for both climate and health. And we're here today to walk through some of the research that we've been doing over the last year or so, some of our findings and some of our thinking that really sits at the intersection of health and climate action. As Harshini noted, my name's John, joined today by my colleague Teslin. So let's launch right in. So the last 12, I want to start off with a little bit of context. The last 12 to 18 months have changed the Canadian climate policy discussion at a national level. The country has bolstered its 2030 target. We've legislated a net zero emissions target by 2050. We've implemented a host of ambitious policies to mitigate emissions, and Canada's carbon price now has the stamp of approval of our National Supreme Court. Now, all of this incredible progress on the climate front means that our fight against the climate crisis is now entering a phase that's perhaps less focused on advocacy and trying to get folks to commit to change, and much more focused on implementation, on construction of projects, and in progress in the very quantifiable, pragmatic sense on the ground. And as communities and companies, and frankly, everyone across the country considers what a net zero GHG emissions target actually looks like and means, it's clear that investments in technologies and services and products and systems that we will need to meet these targets will have an impact on every aspect of our lives. Now, the research we did was mostly focused on how health would be influenced in a green recovery, which had been sort of designed as sort of this post-COVID world. But ultimately, the work has implications for any investment taken to mitigate emissions in the broader push, both towards 2030 and towards this 2050 net zero target. Next slide. So folks who work on progress and who work on policy, I know that for a lot of folks on this call, there's a recognition that any push towards net zero emissions has major implications on many elements of society. And traditionally, when we thought about some of the benefits and costs that accompany these GHG mitigation projects from an economics perspective, we think of them as co-benefits or co-costs, which is to say that they're the additional benefits or costs that are accrued above and beyond the original intention of what a project aimed to do. But that doesn't diminish the fact that these co-benefits or co-costs are very real and are often felt in folks' everyday lives. One of the great examples is health co-benefits, or the health impacts that emerge from spending on the kinds of projects that Canadian communities will need to build and deploy and invest in the years and decades to come. Now, as we said, we see really big potential in work like this. If communities can more readily and easily identify the specific health benefits that come with projects, then it can help inform their decision making. And in an ideal world, communities could have the tools and the information they need to make decisions and craft net zero or climate action strategies that best match their needs and can help achieve multiple policy objectives at once. Next slide. Perfect. So over the last year, part of what we've been doing in Smart Prosperity is thinking a bit about how to identify these health benefits and these impacts in a variety of different work streams. As you can see on the screen, we have 5 public-facing reports that have come out. And today we're going to focus on and highlight 2 reports that we worked on in this piece. One is the center report there, A Green and Healthy Recovery. And the second is Supporting a Greener Well-Being. To illustrate how we've thought about integrating a health lens into discussions around climate action and spending on GHG mitigation in a few different ways. And in the next slide, we'll walk through some of our key findings. So for this first report, which is A Green and Healthy Recovery, my colleague Teslin will sort of walk through the process for what our assessment kept in mind. But what I want to show here is a chart that we created for one of our reports called The Benefits of Cleaner Air, which was authored by myself and Dr. Alini Coutinho. So we wrote a report outlining the process for calculating the health benefits that emerge from improvements in air quality that come from the reductions in air pollution that occur when you build out low carbon infrastructure projects. And it's a step-by-step kind of process breakdown for how analyses like these can actually calculate their impacts. And what you see up on screen is ultimately the 4 steps, along with a series of sub-steps that we detail in this report that talk about how we walk through this analysis, and how to conduct these analyses in different communities and in different regions. So before we walk through some of the results around our green and healthy recovery findings, I wanted to, at a high level, walk through the approach that we took for conducting this analysis, both because it has implications for any similar work that happens in different parts of the country, and because I think starting off with the kind of the high level explanation of the process breakdown is always a useful thing before we get into details. So we started with step 1 and step 2, in which we identified the communities where we wanted to develop emissions baselines and inventories for both greenhouse gases and a couple notable air pollutants. And my colleague Teslin will chat more about that. Past that point, we identified 5 distinct project types or technologies, and we did a comparative analysis of what spending $100 million on each of these 5 sets of technologies in 3 different regions would mean in terms of benefits generated for both health and the environment, which we looked at GHG reductions, as well as reductions in particulate matter and nitrogen dioxide. And once we had our projects and technology selected, we wanted to chat a bit about the regions in question. And so we picked 3 cities located in different regions across Canada with different population makeups, as well as varying sort of levels of air quality, in an effort to try and get a view of what spending this money in cities that looked different but also represented different parts of Canada could mean in terms of the generation of local benefits. We then worked with a consulting firm called Enviroeconomics to do an estimate of the air pollution and GHG reduction benefits that would come from these projects. And then we estimated some of the air quality changes that emerged as a result of these reductions in pollutants. And finally, for step 4, we used a health impact assessment tool developed by Health Canada called the Air Quality Benefits Assessment Tool, which is a model that estimates how changes in air quality impact health outcomes. And using sort of these 4 steps, what we were able to then do is get a sense of how these 5 projects, if deployed in 3 different regions, could have impacts on both health and the environment. This allows us to do things like compare how spending on electric public transit vehicles in one city might compare in terms of benefits to residential energy efficiency retrofits in another city in Canada. Now, the overview that you see here is referenced in the report above, and if you're interested in looking more at sort of the specifics, my colleague Teslin again is going to unpack that. But you can also reference the appendix in our Green and Healthy Recovery report, as well as this report, The Benefits of Cleaner Air, where we talk about some of the tools that communities can use to maybe undertake some of these modeling exercises themselves. And with that, I will throw to my colleague Teslin to give an overview of kind of the Green and Healthy Recovery report and the analysis in question.
Thanks, John. So before I talk about the research, I did want to mention that I'm joining this discussion from Delhi, where the government has actually imposed a lockdown because that's how bad the air is. So this discussion seems particularly pertinent, at this point. So going into the, what our research focused on, as John mentioned, we identified 5 green recovery projects and analyzed the comparative benefits from spending $100 million on each project in 3 cities: Calgary, Quebec City, and Waterloo, Kitchener. So these projects were prominently, featured in post-pandemic economic recovery discussions. The first project we looked at was energy efficiency retrofits for residential buildings. We also looked at benefits from energy efficiency retrofits for commercial buildings. So in this case, in our model, retrofits included deep retrofits and low carbon technology for building envelopes, space heating equipment, improving the energy efficiency of building shells, improving furnace efficiency, and decarbonizing building energy sources. The third project we looked at was installing solar or wind generation capacity to displace electricity from fossil fuels. We also analyzed zero emissions public transit, which included electrification of transit, as well as active transport investments. Finally, the fifth project we analyzed was zero emissions personal vehicles. Here we consider the benefits from electrifying personal vehicles and through improvements in electrification infrastructure, so charging stations. Of course, these 5 green recovery projects aren't the full set of recovery investment options that communities have available to them. So the objective of this analysis is not to prescribe what communities should and shouldn't be investing in. It's more to offer insights about how various green recovery measures could influence health and environmental outcomes, and demonstrate the importance of adapting investment decision-making to the local context. We also hope that our analysis offers a way to further discussions from just technical assessments of health benefits into realizing this potential into practice. Next slide, please. So these are the results of our partial cost-benefit analysis. So we compared the changes in particulate matter and nitrogen dioxide, both of which impact air quality and thereby health. We also looked at environmental benefits from carbon reductions that investing 100 million in these green recovery projects will bring. So overall, we found that residential buildings and transit investments deliver the highest level of average annualized benefits across all 3 regions. Renewable, as you can see on the slide, renewable electricity projects in Calgary offer the highest level of benefit of any project. In fact, almost 8 to 10 times higher than similar investments in Quebec City or Waterloo-Kitchener. This is because of the electricity grid makeup in Alberta, and given the ongoing decarbonization of electricity there, this high level of benefit is likely to fall over time. So in all 3 regions, energy efficiency retrofits for commercial buildings deliver the lowest level of benefits. This is a function of commercial boilers, of the high efficiency of commercial boilers and the relatively lower level of emissions reductions that can be attained through deep decarbonization retrofits. Next slide, please. So I want to draw your attention to the column titled Total Value that's inside that blue box. I'll pause for a couple of seconds to give folks time to look at that part. So this column gives a breakup of the environmental benefits attributable to carbon or GHG reductions and health benefits from reductions in PM2.5 and nitrogen dioxide for each of the 5 green recovery projects in Calgary, Waterloo-Kitchener, and Quebec City. So the dollar values you see, these values represent the health and environmental benefits that each city will gain over the life of these green recovery projects. So for example, over the life of the project, residential buildings in Calgary will result in carbon reductions worth $52.6 million. Particulate matter reduction will bring about gains worth $4.53 million, and nitrogen dioxide reductions will bring about gains worth $0.08 million or $80,000. So as you might have noticed, environmental benefits from GHG reduction is the largest contributor to the overall benefit accrued to individual communities from these recovery investments. This is followed by health benefits, primarily from particulate matter and then nitrogen dioxide. So with the next few slides, I'll briefly go through some of the main findings for each city. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned earlier, for Calgary, overall benefits from investing in solar and wind is almost 2 to 5 times higher than benefits from other investments. Investing in transit decarbonization and retrofitting residential buildings also offers significant benefits for Calgary. In the case of renewable energy, so solar and wind, and residential buildings, retrofitting residential buildings, value is primarily derived from carbon reduction, whereas in the case of transit, significant value in terms of health benefits is also gained from reduction in particulate matter levels. Next slide, please. Getting zero emissions public transit vehicles on the road and improving the energy efficiency of residential buildings are the two project categories that offer the largest overall benefit to Quebec City residents. The key difference between these two projects is that when you make residential buildings more energy efficient, most of the benefits accrued are due to air quality improvements, whereas benefits from transit are primarily attributable to GHG emissions reductions. Next slide, please. So like Quebec City, residential buildings and transit offer the highest overall value to the Waterloo-Kitchener region. These benefits are again primarily attributable to GHG reduction and then reductions in particulate matter. Next slide, please. So analyses like the one we did for Calgary, Quebec City, and Waterloo-Kitchener, which focus on health co-benefits, the direct health co-benefits of low carbon infrastructure are critical for demonstrating their monetary value and their value proposition. But they also only consider the primarily air quality related direct health benefits of green recovery projects. Health, however, is not just the absence of a disease or illness. Organizations like the World Health Organization have long adopted a broader definition of health, whereby health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being. So this broader definition of health means that the conditions in which we live, study, work, the quality of our communities, our interaction with healthcare services, social services, and educational institutions, all of this determines our health. It means that health equity, or our context, determines our ability to be healthy. So within SBI, we have termed this broader concept of health, which considers health equity, as Health Plus. Health Plus captures a holistic view of health and complements the co-benefits frame, which mostly considers direct health benefits primarily from air quality improvements. So Health Plus is a non-quantitative analytical framework whose value lies in that it brings health equity to the forefront of discussions on green recovery and health. So this is critical because only by reducing economic and social inequities and the conditions we need for being healthy can we succeed in improving overall health outcomes in deep and lasting ways. COVID is a brilliant example for why thinking about health equity is important. The uneven distribution of the disease burden of COVID among neighborhoods depending on the ethno-cultural and socioeconomic characteristics is an example of the inherent inequities in health and shows why centering health discussions around equity concerns is important. Next slide, please. So keeping this broader understanding of health in mind, we explored some green recovery ideas, project ideas, and explored how they impacted health and health equity. So we specifically looked at green recovery ideas that we didn't cover in our other analyses. So through two examples, I want to briefly walk you through what applying a broader health perspective to green recovery project ideas could look like. So the first example is expanding active transportation infrastructure. So investments for expanding infrastructure for walking and cycling was recommended a lot in the green recovery discourse, possibly because of an inability or reluctance to use public transit during the pandemic, which led to an over-reliance on single occupancy vehicles. So most direct health benefits from increased use of active transport come from increased physical activity. So consistent active mobility reduces risk of colon cancer and breast cancer, pulmonary and cardiovascular disease, stroke and type 2 diabetes, and in addition to reducing the risk of death. There is also emerging research which suggests that active transport can act as a coping mechanism and become a mediating factor between pandemic severity and life satisfaction through increased access to social networks, greater sense of community, and so on. But these health benefits of active transport are not equitably distributed. From a health equity point of view, generally, higher income neighborhoods have more walkable and bikeable paths. Other factors such as existence of physical disabilities, income of neighborhood, whether it's an urban setting or not, person's age, education level, gender, all influence our access to or engagement with active transport. Women, for example, have different travel patterns compared to men, and active transport infrastructure, which doesn't also consider women's needs, can further inequities. So understanding this disparity and targeting active transport related recovery spending in a way that mitigates these inequities can help improve not just health outcomes, but also reduce health inequities. Safe walking and cycling opportunities can lessen inequities by providing access to better health outcomes or even health services with greater ease, especially for children, the elderly or lower income families who are less likely to own cars. Next slide, please. Another example of the Health Plus framework in action is related to workforce development. So given the context of the pandemic, many green recovery reports we reviewed advocated for policies for green job creation, including training of workforce for green infrastructure projects, ecosystem restoration and management, nature tourism, and so on. So, research shows that being employed is generally good for our physical and mental health, perceived health, and our overall sense of well-being. It reduces the risk of obesity, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular illnesses, and alcohol-related diseases. But while millions of Canadians lost their jobs, either permanently or temporarily during the pandemic, existing inequities dramatically shaped who was most impacted by job loss. So, for example, job loss disproportionately impacted low-wage and part-time workers, women, those employed in high-contact sectors, such as the food service industry, youth between the ages of 15 to 24, minority communities, and recent immigrants. So given this context, targeted workforce development policies, which place the employment needs of these groups, will significantly improve health and health equity for Canadians. I will hand this over to John now to give some key takeaways and concluding remarks.
Thanks, Teslin. So as I hope we've been able to readily emphasize and show in this presentation, there are very real health benefits and positive impacts that can be advanced in any number of projects that would have been put forward in a green recovery, but that will ultimately need to be built out as we move towards our 2030 and 2050 targets and take really ambitious climate action. And the benefits of these projects will be supportive of positive health outcomes, largely wherever they are built. And what is up to decision makers, I think, is whether or not these benefits can be pursued strategically, or whether or not they're the kinds of things that will influence decision making versus, I think, being viewed as, again, sort of these co-benefits and co-costs that are sort of occurring on the side of the broader push to decarbonize. Now, ultimately, in our eyes, those are decisions that every community will need to make because every community is different. And they can make choices around prioritizing the projects that might offer some of the co-benefits that matter most to community members or to decision makers. And perhaps they can even be used to help sort of sell the attractiveness of some of these projects to decision makers as well. Recognizing that I think, as we've pointed out, there's a host of different ways to think about integrating a health lens into decision making, and ultimately the best fit for any respective community is going to be something that they know best. And just the final slide. So as we sort of walk away from this webinar, or perhaps more accurately move into the Q&A section, part of what we have done in a number of the reports that we've laid out is we've overviewed, I think, multiple approaches through which communities could integrate a health lens into climate and low carbon or clean economy spending decisions. And ultimately, if we want to reach net zero, none of the project types that we've discussed in here are going to be put aside. There's going to need to be investments in pretty much everything that reduces emissions across the board. And some of the value of exercises like these is that it can help folks better understand what might make sense to invest in first, what might make sense to prioritize to community members. Maybe there are some projects that become more attractive in this case, because they can also advance a host of other policy objectives that a given community or a given region might have. Part of what we want to do in this case is lay out that if you want to integrate any of these factors into decision making, there's a number of techniques that are included in our reports. So if you want to integrate air quality, you're welcome to use some of the techniques that we laid out in the benefits of cleaner air, and potentially also advocate for some of the simplified or more accessible air quality assessment methods that we also identify in the back end of that report that are useful for decision making, but may not be available in Canada yet. There's also options to integrate, a health plus approach to take a broader perspective on well-being and more robustly sort of integrate health inequities. And I also wanted to give mention to another one of our reports that came out on the nature of health, which looked at the integration of health considerations into spending for nature-based solutions. And ultimately, any of the lenses that get applied are useful for helping communities sort of prioritize the projects that offer the co-benefits that are most interesting or resonate most or best suit the emissions profile or needs of anywhere in Canada. And that's kind of the big hope for our research. So that's largely it for our overview. And I will now, I think, throw back to Harshini to continue.
Thanks so much. That was a very, very interesting presentation. I think it sets us up really, really nicely to dig into some of the details. Before we get started, I did want to introduce formally our discussant, Dave Sawyer, who is a principal economist at the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices and executive in residence at Smart Prosperity Institute. Thanks so much for joining us today. I wanted to kick off by first asking, what are your reflections or some of your thoughts about the presentation that was given, and maybe share what are some insights that you walked away with or what you think the value of the modeling exercise was.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. Thank you for the presentation. Thank you for the opportunity. I'm going to start with a bit of a joke, actually, hopefully a good joke. But so I was hanging out with some biologists because as an economist, I tend to be asked to value things, place a monetary value on something like a health outcome like we did in this report here. And the biologist said to me, you silly economists, if it wasn't for you, we wouldn't have to put a dollar value on everything. And I said, well, you biologists, if it wasn't for you, we wouldn't know we have endangered species. So, if we can't count something, or we can't reveal the type of benefit that we think exists with a certain investment, how do we value it? How do we understand the decision at hand, and how do we understand what do we get for what do we spend? So when I think about the work we just did here, it's really important work in that it's shining a really interesting spotlight on an area, low carbon investments, in an area that generates significant local economic benefits associated with really good health outcomes. And in the country right now, we don't do a really good job about bundling up the benefits of climate policy. What do we get for what do we spend? And we tend to just be focused on these very long-term and diffuse benefits that presumably accrue to other generations, although British Columbia today would have a very different view of long-term benefits from reducing emissions. But typically we've thought about very diffuse benefits at some point in the future. And so to the extent that we can localize benefits and reveal their importance, we can then make decisions around choices about how to invest, how to regulate. I often think of Canada's focus on light duty vehicles and energy efficiency with regulations around light duty vehicles, and a lack of regulations around heavy duty vehicles for commercial reasons. We don't want to slow the economy down. We don't want to hurt the trucking industry. But if you actually looked at those two regulations, you see very large health benefits associated with diesel emissions, and in particular, diesel emissions in places where we live. So all that to say, I like to think about this approach around identifying a full range of benefits, quantifying what you can, maybe some health outcomes, and then monetizing a small subset of those benefits. And you can only monetize sometimes because of technical reasons. I think one of the reasons we haven't done a lot of health valuation in the country is because the air quality people get very uptight about trying to downscale, the models to give a change in local air quality. And as this study demonstrates pretty clearly, well, we can develop order of magnitude estimates fairly simply and fairly straightforward to reveal the importance of these benefits. So sometimes you can quantify a reduction in emissions, but you can't quantify a change in ambient air quality, which then leads to the health outcomes that were just presented. So I like to really just think about, okay, what are the broad range, identify those benefits, quantify some of those that you can, savings in something, and then monetize what you can from there. And then my last thoughts are, okay, so what are the types of benefits we care about when we're implementing these projects, local projects at municipal level or at provincial level? So I think there's broad-based, to start, there's sort of, they catalyze value, local value. So there's beneficial financial, environmental, and social outcomes that stem from these investments that accrue to governments, households, and the private sector. And those benefits may be splattered about, and any single group may not, gain enough benefit to offset their costs. But when you take a social perspective and you bundle these costs together, or the benefits, you can sort of get a better picture of the good outcomes that come from these investments. So what are these investments? Or these benefits that come from the investments? So we talked about the health. So there's always local productivity benefits. One of the things we didn't do in the study, we sort of threw $100 million at some tech, but there's all kinds of fuel savings and operational savings. And those can accrue to peoples, to households, to municipalities. So yes, capital intensive investment, but increasingly those investments are being subsidized by the federal government or a provincial government. So that's like an injection of cash into the local economy. And that creates local economic activity, which is a separate benefit we didn't talk about here. So the idea that there's multipliers that sort of generate economic benefits that are another stream of sort of positive outcomes that we can talk about for a project. With the energy savings, obviously, it sort of reduces income impacts on people. There can be local operating budget savings in the long term, that sort of thing. And then there can be all kinds of property or environmental benefits associated with property value increases. There's all kinds of literature that basically says cleaner air leads to higher housing values, which leads to higher municipal valuations, which lead to higher tax rates. And so, it's a small benefit, but it could, in time, it could be material. So yeah, we like to think of this whole sort of range of benefits. So I would just encourage you, when you're thinking of these issues, brainstorm. What are the range, look at the literature, brainstorm. What are the range of benefits that we can expect to get out of here? Let's tell a story with those benefits. And then let's quantify outcomes that we think we can do, liters of fuel saved, which results in a reduction in operating budgets of this much. And then ambient air quality changes, changes in water quality, these sorts of things that can be generated. And then paint a picture with your numbers and your story to provide a more comprehensive view. And then, of course, talk about the economic impact, which is, okay, if we're injecting money into a region, there's going to be jobs, there's going to be GDP. And as I said, typically and increasingly, these investments come from outside the community, from another level of government, and they result in a net increase in local economic activity. At the national level, you're just pulling money from one area and investing it somewhere else, and it's a wash. But when you get down to the local level and you drop money into an economy, it's usually a direct injection of activity locally. So you can talk about those sort of benefits. To the extent we can get a subsidies from the federal government, from the carbon tax revenue, it results in this level of increased economic activity, more municipal tax revenue, et cetera. There's all kinds of stuff. So I think I'll stop there, and I just want to applaud SPI and Health Canada for pushing this piece forward. I think Canada's done a really poor job at telling the story to Canadians about what they get from climate action. And I really hope that there'll be more of this sort of analysis going on to really balance out this cost argument around climate policy and bring it to this local benefit story, which resonates, children's health, local value, that sort of thing. So I'll stop there and turn it back over.
Thanks so much. I think that you've touched on a lot of very, very interesting things. I wanted to pick up on that thread of benefits and go to Bruce. So my question is that I think what we've learned is we know accounting for both sets of benefits is complicated, and the transition to net zero emissions is one where we do need to remain focused on reducing greenhouse gases. Do you think asking policymakers to also think about health impacts could potentially get in the way of remaining focused on reducing greenhouse gases?
Yeah, I think there was also a very good question in the Q&A from Sheriff Freeman, which is similar. And I thought I would try to kind of take on both those questions. So what we did with coal-fired power plants is basically reframe the problem. And so we took it from an abstract, from multiple abstract concepts like climate change, smog, air pollution, into how do we change the primary polluter in a system, and that was coal in electricity. And so more of that thinking is needed. And to be honest, I think in this conversation, even a lot of this needs to be reframed around what are the particular things that we're trying to solve for. The problem is solving for climate change is solving for changing the world in a million different ways. And there are a lot of specific pieces. So are we talking about replacing diesel fuel in long haul freight? Are we talking about getting coal out of coking, out of steel manufacturing? Are we talking about, reducing, fuel use in buildings? Like those, until we start to frame around the very specific things and then look at what the benefits are in those different systems, I think we're having the wrong conversation. So it's all about climate change, but we kind of have to stop talking about it as though it's about climate change. It's about changing the fundamental systems of, providing food, providing transportation, providing heat for buildings, et cetera. And then once you get into those, you can start looking at, well, where are the benefits with respect to food? And reducing nitrogen fertilizer input has all kinds of benefits for climate change, but it has all kinds of probably even larger benefits for not polluting rivers and waterways. So I guess what I would suggest is that we really need to think about what is the focused conversation that we're having and how do you integrate health into that? And just as an anecdote, I was doing a consulting assignment for what was Environment Canada. And I'm going to say this was back in the 1990s. And they actually refused the idea that you could even talk about co-benefits. No, you have to talk about climate change. And if you don't, basically it was like, it was so much the opposite. So, we're, anyway, I'm rambling a little bit, but we're, I think, in retrospect, we're looking back at these things as though it was obvious to talk about health and coal. There were people opposing the idea of actually bringing health into the coal conversation because they thought it diluted the environmental message. So, a lot of this is very much about reframing the problem.
That's really, really interesting. I think following on this thread of sort of benefits, I wanted to go back to Dave and understand a little bit more about, why we see different benefits. So can you walk me through in your eyes why we would expect to see different modeling results in different cities? Is it purely a result of, different emissions profiles on the ground, or are there actually other factors at play as well? Oh, I think you're muted, Dave.
Zoom now tells me when I'm muted. Sure, so there's a number of drivers. I mean, there's the local air quality context. So what does your emission profile look like? What does your ambient air quality look like? Which includes sort of a function of local air quality and sort of long range transport. So you may have an upstream, an upstream smokestack like in Delhi, like Tesla has in Delhi right now, where it's apparently crop burning, she said. And then population density is a function. So, obviously these health outcomes are directly correlated to the exposure of a population. So that really matters. And then the second piece, the reason we see such a difference in the results between regions is the emission profile of the fuel. So in a high emission intensity jurisdiction like Alberta and Calgary, where you have a lot of emissions associated with electricity, the emission factor is higher, the emissions are higher. So when you fuel switch out, you get a bigger reduction in benefits. So the technology and the sort of energy carriers and their emission intensity really matter. And so you have to sort of understand your local context in a big way. What are you switching out? What are you switching to? And really it boils down to what are the emission factors, and then what's the ambient air quality looking like? Yeah, so I'll stop.
Thank you. And I really like how you touched on that point of local context. I think if I could go to my colleagues, in the kind of qualitative analysis that you'd conducted, I wanted to ask, does it account for inequities due to factors like gender or income for different individuals or within communities? And if so, what are some interesting insights that actually came up?
So I can take a shot at that. So yeah, we absolutely looked at gender and income inequality. So one of the components of the Health Plus framework is socio-economic and demographic factors. So this included income level, gender, race, and so on. I'll talk about one example to tell you something interesting. So one of the projects we assessed was municipal solid waste management. So when we started looking at this particular issue, we realized that there is evidence to suggest that typically landfills are located near communities with individuals of lower income, lower education, or ethnic minorities. So especially in the case of indigenous communities, this is particularly true. And this is exacerbated by the fact that many times there is no many indigenous communities, they lack proper amenities for waste disposal. So leading to various informal and unsafe methods for waste management. So what ends up happening is that it contaminates the air, the water, and the soil. This kind of a nuanced understanding would not have come out clearly if we hadn't taken an equity lens to looking at green recovery projects. We would have just gotten aggregate numbers, and that's how we would have dealt with it.
I think I can also speak to a couple points, because I think Teslin did a really good job of framing how the health equity lens was meaningfully integrated into the kind of the Health Plus approach, and that's supporting a greener well-being analysis. It's not something that we unfortunately did or had the ability to do within our green and healthy recovery work. That was largely a function of the health impact model, which the primary way that it sorts the population is through age, not necessarily other factors. But it is something that we'd like to look into more, and it's something that I think future research could pick up on really well, because we understand that within cities and within urban areas, the impacts of pollutants are not uniformly distributed. Transportation corridors next to highways tend to be both disproportionately lower income and have lower levels of air quality. There's actually some great research that's been done, and I'll shout out a researcher from the University of British Columbia, Amanda Jiang, who's done some really great work on health equity and the impacts of poor air quality or air pollution on particular marginalized or vulnerable groups. There's a lot of more research to be done in this space, and we feel it's an area that's really well suited to look at more, because it's a critically important thing to understand.
Thanks so much. And I think that sort of brings us to the close of the discussion. I recognize that we're very close to the hour, but we do have some questions from the audience. I know that Bruce took a shot at answering Shira's question, but I also wanted to offer a chance for other folks to maybe jump in on it. So could the speakers comment on parallels between the strong action on the coal phase out and climate decision making? Specifically in the case of coal, there were 3 influencing factors: strong health evidence, public perceptions of risk, and feasible replacements, i.e. other fossil fuels. To what extent are these drivers or others present for climate decision making? Open floor for anyone to take a shot.
I'm happy to take a stab at that. I know that Bruce already did. Of the 3 factors that I think Shira lists here, for strong health evidence, public perceptions of risk, and feasible replacements, pretty much all of the projects or technologies that were touched on in our analysis, there is strong health evidence of the impacts of and the benefits of making some of these investments, and there are feasible replacements. We're looking at things like vehicle electrification and energy efficiency retrofits. The challenge, and I think this speaks to the point that Bruce was making, is that the public perception of risk on the case of the coal phase out was a result of the advocacy campaign and the reframe and the communications and the narrative piece. And so part of, I think, what work like this and the value of this work aims to do is readily identify some of those pieces so that they are easier to communicate, in an effort to hopefully try and get that triple win across this range of areas where you really can readily identify and advance the positive health impacts.
I just want to throw one other factor in here, which is sort of competitiveness. The farther an industry is from international trade, the heavier the touch on regulation. So electricity has been heavily regulated, and it continues to be heavily regulated with climate policy in particular in the country, primarily because A, the utilities can pass on usually 100% or 95% of the costs. And obviously in Ontario, the Liberal Party had an issue with rising electricity prices, but typically politicians can muck around and get away with it. So there is that sort of feasibility competitiveness piece that is really important in electricity and explains a lighter touch on our traded industries. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Doesn't seem to be that. Maybe we're done with that question. Hopefully that answers it. I'm gonna pose one more question, although I'll just say maybe 30-second thoughts on it. So Ellen asked, municipal and provincial decision makers rarely face blue sky big picture choices on investments. More often they face immediate budget challenges such as, do we want to pour refurbishing funds into an antiquated system? So those are the teachable moments for policymakers. So it would help. Oh, this is a comment. My apologies. I thought this was a question. But any kind of maybe reactions to that comment?
I can jump in there. I mean, I really like this comment. So, yeah, it's hard to basically these are capital intensive decisions, and capital budgets tend to be limited, and especially municipalities. So it's hard to make these choices. Ideally, painting a picture of what we get for what we spend would help here, and maybe building in the operational savings, which typically municipalities can do. And then secondly, increasingly, we're seeing long-term strategic plans, net zero plans coming out of municipalities, which then can signal long-term transitions to the decision makers and to think about long-term planning, budget planning. So I know Edmonton has one, Calgary, I did some work in Edmonton, and yeah, I think that sort of dual piece. Okay, what do we get now? Let's think about it. Oh, where are we going? Okay, we need to think about changing the investment pattern.
Yeah, and sorry if I can just connect the two. I think Alan's point's really important. So Ontario was actually facing some critical decisions about future investments in the future of energy. So the question was, where do they make those investments? It wasn't like the coal plants were going to continue to exist. So it was an opportunity to get into the decision-making process at the point in which they needed to make major decisions and try to shift those decisions more into renewables, combined cycle gas and the things that ultimately were lower carbon. So I think it's that combination of things actually is really important.
And I think with that, I will sort of call an end to the session. Thank you so much to Dave and Bruce for offering your insights. Very, very invaluable. I certainly took away a lot. Thank you so much, Teslin and John, for sharing the great work that we've been doing. And thanks everyone for being so engaged and for joining us today. Please feel free to read our reports. They're very, very good pieces of work, and feel free to join us next week as well on the 25th. We do have a final event for this installment on exploring the intersection of health, nature, climate, and the economy. Also, there will be a short survey that'll, I believe, be shared in the chat box. So please feel free to share your thoughts on our event, as well as pose any additional questions you would like the panelists to tackle. Thanks again, everyone, and wishing you a good rest of your day and week.
Great. Thank you very much.